Good morning. It is 10 o'clock and we have some attendees here. I think we're getting some late arrivals, but in respect for everyone's time, thank you for joining us this morning for what I think is going to be a super informative webinar on fiscal policy and state budgeting 101. My name is Stephanie Wells, and I'm the president of the Indiana Fiscal Policy Institute, and we are the state's only nonpartisan government research organization. So we study and provide information on state taxing and spending in Indiana. So not very much federal government. However, we will be reporting on Medicaid here shortly, and that is obviously a state and federal program. So a few housekeeping items. I think that though you heard that we are recording this webinar, so we will be providing the PowerPoint and the recording to you probably early next week. The other thing is I see that the Q&A is working. Thank you, Sue, for being our first question asker. Since we're going through so much content today, I'm going to hold off on the Q&A until Susan and Ben have completed their presentation. If we do not get to your question for any reason during the time allotted today, never fear. We will still follow up with you after today. So we will not leave any of you hanging at all. We just know we have a lot of people registered for today, and we expect a lot of questions. And this is a dense amount of information that we're going to be getting to you. So without further ado, I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. We have Ben Tooley, the former fiscal analyst from the Indiana House Republican Caucus, and Susan Preble, former fiscal analyst for the Indiana Senate Democrats. Take it away, guys.
Good morning. I guess I'll kick it off. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm excited to give this presentation. It's a lot, like Stephanie said, it's a lot of information and it's probably a little bit dense. But again, I think it's important to understand the process the state goes through to put together a biennial budget. It is truly the most important piece of legislation that goes through the General Assembly. Only happens once every 2 years, and it's important to understand the timing of things and how things work. I think for those of you who would like to be able to interact with the state budget, it would be helpful to know kind of when are these points in time when you may want to be paying special attention, especially if you're hoping to see something in the budget. So thank you very much again. As Stephanie said, Ben Tooley. I was a fiscal analyst in the Ways and Means Office for almost 18 years. First session with the House was 2008. I was part of 10 biennial budgets in my time at the House, 8 of them as part of the majority party. So first 2 were kind of practice runs. The last 8, I actually had to do a little bit of work to get them at least through on the House side and then through the final process. So very glad to be joined by Susan. I'll kick it over to her to introduce herself. But when I think I put out a post on LinkedIn, if anybody saw it, that I said my good friend Susan Preble, and that I truly mean that. Susan and I were on different sides of the aisle when we worked together at the General Assembly. And not only that, we were also House versus Senate, which has some natural friction there. But I will tell you, Susan was a great person to work with all those years. Always enjoyed going, through policy with her. We didn't always agree on things, but she always asked a ton of great questions and pressed me to give her good answers. So very glad to be joined by Susan today, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Ben. I feel exactly the same way. And Ben and I started together, actually. Our first session was 2008, which was the property tax reform session. I think we probably both still have PTSD from that session. Anyway, I was at the Senate Democratic Caucus as their fiscal analyst for 15 years, so almost the same amount of time as Ben. Unfortunately, never in the majority, but really enjoyed my time there, and working with Ben was one of the highlights of my career with the caucus. So we are thrilled that there are so many people who are interested in this material. We often would feel like we're the only ones, or the caucus analysts would be the only people who are into this stuff, but it's very gratifying to know that you're all at least interested. So we hope that we can be helpful today. look forward to your questions.
Right. Well, thank you. I guess I'm going to kick things off here. Stephanie, could you put it in presentation mode? That may be easier for people to see. And while that's going on, Susan's right. Our first session together was 2008, and we did House Bill 1001, which was major property tax reform. My last session in the House was 2025, and we did major property tax reform. So,
Is this better, Ben?
yeah, this is better. Thank
Awesome.
you. Yeah, I think that'll help folks see it. So, definitely came full circle, and that was maybe a bit of a, maybe a nudge for me that time to try something different after, you know, being part of two major reforms over the course of your career. It makes you realize how long you've been around. So, anyways, without further ado, going to jump into the presentation here. We're going to go through the steps of the process, and the steps of the process in this PowerPoint are more focused on the formal process, timelines, what happens when. I'm sure at the end of the presentation, Susan and I would be happy to answer questions about kind of what really happens informally. How do these budgets actually come together? How do we land where we land through the process? Which, like any legislative process, there's a lot of give and take, and you have to be able to negotiate and compromise at the end of the day. But we'll go through the formal steps, and we can get into those things later if people are interested. Also going to talk about just kind of the policy implications of the budget. We'll walk through the major budget components and what percentage of the budget those components make up. And then it's not on this slide, unfortunately. I should have added it, but Susan's going to go through our just the makeup of the state's combined reserve balances, what all falls into those buckets, and then she's going to talk about revenue as well. And revenue is obviously a very important part of the equation. It's in fact half the equation. You got to know how much revenue you think you're going to have before you can decide how to spend it. So she's going to get into that at the end of the presentation. But I think I'm ready to go to the next slide, Stephanie. Okay, some of this information is going to be super basic. I know a lot of you folks have been around the process, but for the folks who haven't been, just some real basic information here. Indiana has a biennial budget process, which means we do a budget that covers 2 state fiscal years. Those fiscal years run from July through June, so July 1 to June 30th. The process begins in the summer of each even-numbered year, so hard to believe. I feel like I just got done with the last budget, and this summer, summer really, it'll be time for the process to start all over again. Budgets are adopted during legislative long sessions. So currently we're in the middle of almost a quarter of the way through a short session, which is hard to believe. But budgets happen in the long session, which run from typically sometime in early January. And then the last possible day is right around that April 30th timeframe. So you have to have everything done in that window, which seems like a long time, but it goes fast. So 2025, last budget cycle, covered fiscal years 2026, 2027. We are now just over halfway through fiscal year 26. And then the final thing on this slide, doing a budget is a joint venture, truly a joint venture between the executive and legislative branches. Ultimately, the legislature is going to have the final say on what to fund and at what levels. The governor and his team, they're going to be the ones that have to implement the budget, but they are also very involved in the front end, and we'll get to that here on the next slide. Or sorry, 2 slides from now. Okay, key players. So who are the folks that are involved in the process? One group that is very involved in the front end and then very involved in the back end is the State Budget Committee. So if you're familiar with the State Budget Committee, it's a 5-member committee. It is made up of 1 member from each legislative caucus. So typically it's going to be your Democrat and Republican leaders on Ways and Means and Appropriations, usually the Appropriations Chairman and the Ways and Means Chairman, and then the ranking members, typically of the Appropriations Ways and Means Committee. And then the 5th member of the committee is the State Budget Director. So the majority, this is a very unusual committee. One, it's a joint committee between the executive and legislative branches. And two, you have the unique circumstance where The state budget director is of the party of the governor, so the party of the governor is the majority of the committee, regardless of the makeup of the House and the Senate. You could have supermajority Republicans in the House and Senate. If you have a Democrat governor, the state budget committee is majority Democrat. So just an interesting factoid. Executive branch, governor, obviously, the secretary of the Office of Management and Budget, and then the state budget director and their teams. And they have large teams of people that do a lot of the work and help us out tremendously. On the House of Representatives sides, obviously the key player is going to be the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. You have the Ways and Means ranking minority member. And then the Speaker of the House, Minority Leader, obviously are going to be involved as well. Same thing on the Senate side, Chairman of Senate Appropriations, the Appropriations Ranking Minority Member, and then the President Pro Tem and the Minority Leader. And of course, you have a lot of other members. Typically, the Ways and Means Committee members very involved in the process. Typically, the Appropriations Committee members are involved as well. So, next slide. Okay, so what do we budget? Well, in a large picture sense, a state budget is going to budget three types of funds. State general funds are the biggest, and the one that that's what gets all the focus in the budget process, because those are discretionary dollars. The state can spend those general fund dollars on essentially anything it wants to. They're the primary source of funding for things like K-12 education, higher education, corrections, child welfare. They're the state component of Medicaid funding. It's the state share. So that is going to be the biggest driver of the process and what people are going to focus on. And we'll get into it on the revenue slides that Susan will talk about. But the funds are mostly derived from your state taxes and fees, income tax, sales tax, things like that. Dedicated funds, you'll see some mention of dedicated funds in the budget. They're a lot more restricted. For the most part, there are some that have, the Tobacco Master Settlement Fund, for example, is one that has some flexibility. But typically, they are funds that are levied for a specific purpose, whether it's a license fee or, state, you pay your admission to get into the state park, whatever it may be. Typically, you have the fee is levied, and then it's going to go to something that's very related to the purpose, right? Buy your state park pass, it goes to help support the parks, right? It doesn't go into the general fund necessarily to go and fund anything else. So wide range of things: licenses, permits, user fees, lottery proceeds, unemployment insurance taxes. They all fall into this bucket. The other big one that I didn't have on this list, but it falls into the user fee category, is fuel taxes. Fuel taxes are obviously a major tax source. They are not considered general funds, so they're not part of the state forecast, revenue forecast. They are brought in for the purposes of then returning those back to road funding. And then federal funds. The amount of federal funds has grown significantly just since I've been around. You've had some big rounds of stimulus funding over the years. Back in the Great Recession days, had a big impact or a big influx of federal funds. And then, of course, recently the COVID, the ARPA dollars, all those things, that was a massive uptick in federal funding. But typically those funds are, in most cases, generally speaking, they're kind of out of the state's control. They're for a specific purpose that the federal government has delineated to say, this is how you're going to use the money. And the majority of those dollars outside of stimulus programs are going to go to things like public welfare, Medicaid being the biggest, transportation, and education. Okay, jumping into the process, I'm going to try to go through these quickly here as best as I'm able to do so. I tend to probably talk too long on things. First step of the process is the preparation phase, right? And that's what we're going to be getting into over the course of this summer. The very first thing that's going to happen is the agencies are going to put together their budget packages, and that's actually going to start probably even still late spring, maybe very early summer. They're going to be working to do two things. One, they're going to be trying to calculate what their base budget is. And by that, what that means is trying to figure out how much do we need to just carry on operations as is. If we're going to keep operating at this level, what do we need in order to do that? But they're also going to be looking at things like change packages, and change packages are typically requests to increase their appropriation. It may be, maybe they need more staff to carry out their mission, or in a lot of cases, they're looking to implement a new program or a new initiative that's going to require state funds. So those are going to be kind of separated out from the base budget calculation, so folks can kind of decide, all right, do we, what are we going to do that's new and different, and is that something we can afford as we go through the budget process? So that's going to happen mid to late summer. Those base budgets and change packages from the agencies are going to get submitted to the state budget agency. State budget agency is the agency that oversees the creation and implementation of the state's biennial budget. They are going to take a look at all these requests, and they're going to be that first filter stage. So they're going to go back to the agencies and say, yeah, that change package sounds great. That's right in line with the governor's agenda. Let's go for it. Or they're going to say, yeah, that one doesn't sound so hot. I think we'll skip it this year. Or, in a tight budget situation, they're going to say, yeah, sorry, no money for it. But they're going to be that first filter. Once that filter happens, and they're going to spend their summer, late summer, early fall, going through these budgets, hopefully with a fine-tooth comb. The next stage of the process is the first time the legislature really gets involved, and that's through the state budget committee review process, and that is typically happening in late fall. Sometimes we start as early as late October. Typically, the meetings are in November and December. What will happen is agencies, after they've been through the filter process of the budget agency, they're going to come before the budget committee and they're going to present their budget asks for the upcoming biennium. It's the first chance for the legislature to kind of go, okay, this is what things are looking like, right? Here's what people want. Here's what people need. Start to get an idea of where things are headed. All right, next slide. Take a sip of coffee here. So once the budget hearings have taken place, folks have had a chance to say, hey, here's our ideal wish list of what we would like, minus everything the budget agency told us we couldn't ask for. The next real big milestone in this process is to do the revenue forecast. Typically happens in mid-December. Again, Susan's going to talk more on the revenue side, but just high level. It's a bipartisan bipartisan committee called the Revenue Forecast Technical Committee. It reflects the makeup of the budget committee. So you're going to have one member from all four legislative caucuses. That was a committee that Susan and I were privileged to work on for Susan longer than me. She was on the committee for her entire time with the Senate. I was on the committee for, I think, 10 years. But it's a bipartisan committee. It's a joint effort between the executive and legislative branches. And then we also have an outside economist. So what that means, you have a 3-3, I'm sorry, not 3-3. You have 6 people on the committee. So you would have a tie if, people split 3-3. So what that means is you can't really take a vote on the forecast. People, in order to put the forecast forward, the people on the committee have to agree to it. And I'll let Susan talk about that. Consensus forecast, in my opinion, absolutely the way to go. But I'll let her get in more details. I just wanted to give you a quick preview. So revenue forecast, get that in mid-December. Now you get a chance to look and say, okay, all right, here's everything the agencies want. Here's everything other folks are looking for in the budget. But now reality is smacking us in the face, right? We only have so much money, or at least we think we only have so much money because it's a forecast of the future. And so at that point, the governor's team has to get together and say, okay, all right, here's how much we have to work with. What are our priorities? What are we going to fund? What are we not going to fund? What are we going to say is our, legislative agenda going forward? Where do we want to put our money, right? So we're taking all these policies that we talk about, and we're going to put our money where our mouth is. And so that process will culminate in early January in having a recommended budget from the governor. That is going to be your starting point. Typically, it doesn't have to happen this way, but by tradition, the governor's recommended budget, it gets recommended to the budget committee. The budget committee reviews it. We'll typically say, okay, all right, Great job. Good starting point. You got to start somewhere, right? And that budget will most likely become the as introduced version of House Bill 1001. So unlike a lot of bills where the member who introduces it, it's their proposal, their idea. House Bill 1001 is going to start as the governor's vision for what he thinks the budget, or he or she thinks the budget should look like. Okay, next slide. So at that point, if you're a poor legislative staffer like Susan and I, now the real work begins. Budget bill gets introduced in the House. Ways and Means Chairman is typically the author. And then the next stage is it is a major information gathering process, right? So we're going to do that in a couple different ways. And the main public facing way is to have committee budget hearings. So in the fall, agencies come before the state budget committee and say, hey, this is what we'd love to have. Hope the money's there for it. Now we've had a revenue forecast. Now the governor has weighed in. So now we're going to have the agencies back and they're going to say, all right, well, okay, this is what we want now, right? And we may also invite other folks in to talk about their budget requests. For example, K-12 schools, they're not a state agency, but we want to make sure they have an opportunity to come in and say, boy, this is what we'd really like to see when it comes to K-12 funding. Universities, same type of thing. So that's one part of the process. There's, of course, also a gazillion meetings that happen with members behind the scenes. If you've ever been around the Ways and Means Committee or the chairman's office in January or February, you're typically going to see a line of people out the door waiting to get in and talk about the budget bill. So lots and lots of meetings, lots of discussion about, where are we headed with this thing? So once you get through that part of the process, then it becomes just like any other bill. And I won't spend a lot of time on this. Committee amendments and vote, goes to the floor process, third reading. Hopefully it passes. If it passes, it goes to the Senate, and the Senate's going to do a pretty similar process on their side. The only difference is it'll be led by typically the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, who will sponsor the bill. So process repeats, and then everybody thinks we know what we're doing. And then we got this bill that's been floating around for a while. And then next thing you know, it's April, and we get to mid-April, and we have a new revenue forecast. This revenue forecast is not as robust as the one in December. It's typically just an update, and Susan will go into the details, but it's typically just going to be, we're going to update the economic data that goes into the models. But this is a huge milestone. I have been part of budget sessions where literally the forecast changed by a net total of $1 million, which is nothing. That's like finding a penny in your couch cushion, right? Essentially no change. The last one I was a part of, and I had the privilege of delivering the news to the budget committee as part of my role in the revenue forecast committee, we took $2 billion out of the forecast, almost $1 billion each year for 26 and 27. That's not the kind of news people want to get, right? Because here you've been working with this information and you think you know what you're doing, and all of a sudden you have a massive, massive monkey wrench thrown into the process. And, that's challenging, especially when you're talking about a forecast that happens, in this case, on the 16th of April, and you got to get this thing wrapped up by the end of the month. So not fun. Much rather have the situation of, nothing changes or nothing changes significantly, but it happens. And then I've been part of the opposite too, where all of a sudden you have a uptick in the forecast, and now you have all this money on the table that you haven't contemplated, and folks are going to be looking to compete to get those dollars. So can that go a lot of different ways? It's always something you just kind of hold your breath, cross your fingers, and hope for the best. Okay. So once you get through all this process, again, just like any other bill, it goes to conference committee. Depending on the situation, like I said, if there's more revenue, that's tough. If there's less revenue, that's really tough. If revenue is about the same, makes the process easier. But there's going to be many, many hours spent, most of them behind the scenes, often till late in the night, I just kind of, when I was with the House, I just kind of figured that if I got home before midnight, I'd be having pretty good night during conference committee, because there's just a lot of work that has to be done to sort out the differences between the Senate and the House. You're talking about hundreds of line items, and not everybody's going to see eye to eye. Plus, you have a revenue forecast that could cause things to change. But generally, it's going to be a similar process. Typically, all 4 caucuses will participate to some degree. The governor's office is going to want to weigh in. But just to be real about the situation, the bulk of the negotiations, when it comes down to the nitty gritty, typically between the House author and Senate sponsor. And then at that point, hopefully, you come to some kind of conclusion. Hopefully, you get 4 signatures on the budget, and conference committee report goes up for a vote for one final time before the House and the Senate. Hopefully everybody votes for it and can put a bow on it, and the legislature can go home. Doesn't always happen. We have had situations where 1001 failed to pass. That happened in 2009. Definitely connected to the Great Recession, uncertainty over the revenue forecast at the time. But if that happens, the governor's going to have to call a special session, get everybody back in, and say, "Hey, we gotta get to work here." And you're going to go through the process all over again. But fortunately, you won't have all the other bills to deal with, and it's a much more condensed time frame. So if the governor signs 1001, or it goes into law, one way or another, it goes forward, gets enacted. One thing to point out, sorry, Stephanie, I take a step back here. Important to note that, I'm sorry, you're on the right slide. That's my bad. One more. Yeah, there you go. Just wanted to point out, in Indiana, the governor does not have line item veto authority. It's either an all or nothing vote, or all or nothing for him. He either vetoes it, or he says, let's go for it, and he signs it, or I guess he can choose not to sign it and it goes into law anyways. But there's no ability for the governor to go in and say, I don't like that appropriation, I don't like this appropriation. So just wanted to note that some states, governors have that ability. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm going to try to go through this real fast. Once the budget is in place, it's been passed by the General Assembly. Now it's up to the governor to implement it. The governor does have some tools in his hands to be able to manage the budget process. The biggest tool is the budget agency has the ability to allot funds, right? So yes, there's an appropriation, but the budget agency does not have to allot that entire appropriation to an agency. They have the ability to hold back dollars. They can also do allotments on a quarterly basis and say, okay, we're going to take it slow. We're going to give you the first 3 months of your appropriation. We'll see how it goes, and we'll give you the next 3, so on and so forth. Typically, the budget agency is going to withhold some level of allotments. The standard process over the year, or the standard practice over the years, has been 2 to 3% as a management reserve. This can be much higher during times of fiscal uncertainty. For example, this particular budget, the appropriations were cut 5%, and the budget bill gave direction to the budget agency to withhold an additional 5% from the allotments, just to ensure that our fiscal situation was under control. Okay, go to the next slide. Throughout the interim, the state budget committee continues to weigh in on the budget. There will be a number of items that have to go before the budget committee for review, which is not approval. We could talk about that for a long time, but there's a standard of budget committee review, and that creates a legislative check or legislative oversight on the implementation of the budget. Not everything has to go to budget committee review. Operating appropriations generally do not have to go to the budget committee unless there's a need to augment an appropriation. But capital projects, so if we appropriate money for a new state police post or a higher education building, that has to come before the budget committee to be reviewed before those dollars can be released. Throughout the process, there's a lot of reporting, transfers, oversight. Most of that is managed by the state budget agency, the state comptroller. the State Board of Accounts. The State Budget Director is given the authority to transfer appropriations within an agency. So if FSSA is short in one account, but they have extra money in another, there's the ability for the budget director to grant authority to transfer those dollars, even though it may not match the appropriation levels. But if there's a transfer between agencies, so from one agency to the next, it has to go before the State Board of Finance, and that's made up of the governor, state comptroller, treasurer, or their designees. Okay, next slide. Fiscal year closeout. So every June 30th, you got to close the books on the fiscal year, make sure all the books are balanced. That's a process that's mostly managed by the state budget agency and the state comptroller. They're working together to make sure, hey, state comptroller sent out X number of payments, the budget agency had X amount of appropriation. They're going to make sure all those accounts get reconciled before the end of the year. If general fund appropriation is not spent, so typically that's happening when there's some kind of withholding, or maybe an agency just doesn't need to spend every dollar they're appropriated. Those appropriations typically get reverted to the general fund unless there is a statute or a note in the budget bill itself that says funds do not revert. And that's typically the practice for general fund, not typically the practice for dedicated funds. Those funds typically stay in the account and roll over from year to year. The budget agency, as part of the process, is going to put out a number of closeout documents that are going to create a snapshot of kind of where the state stands in terms of its reserve balances. How much did we spend for the year? Did we need any augmentations? Did we spend more than we took in? All those things are how much money we reverted. All those things are part of the closeout documents that get posted at the end of the fiscal year on the budget agency website. Okay, next slide. And then the last phase is really the audit phase. So once the money has been appropriated, we've done all the planning, we've gone through the process of appropriating the money. The budget agency has taken primary responsibility for managing the funds and implementing the budget. The last phase is really just the audit phase. So the State Board of Accounts is responsible for ensuring that funds were spent in a legal manner and everyone complied with laws and no money went missing. So that's their role in the process, and they're going to perform audits throughout the year on the agencies to make sure everything was done correctly according to law. Okay, I'm going to take a quick breath, but that is the process part. I hope I didn't put anybody to sleep on that, but I thought it was important to just go through all the steps, especially if you're looking to interact with the budget in some way. It's good to know, hey, if I'm trying to get in with an agency about one of their programs that I would like to see, some change to, then you probably want to get in to see them in the summer before the budget. If it's more of a legislative thing, well, you better get in sometime before April, or really should get in sometime before, the end of March to make sure those kind of things can happen. So as far as the budget is concerned, I think I talked about this. It is constitutional duty of the General Assembly. The General Assembly has the power of the purse strings. It's also the most significant policy statement made throughout the year. It's where you have an opportunity to put your money where your mouth is. It's going to set the state's priorities and hopefully provide the funding needed to achieve the state's goals. One thing to say here, as part of this process, the administration itself does a ton of work in the summer to put together the budgets for the agencies. And generally, in most cases, the General Assembly is going to accept the vast majority of the governor's team's recommendations on funding levels when it comes to state agencies. This past budget was a little different because we had a much worse April forecast and had to go in and make adjustments right at the end of session. But generally speaking, in most cases, General Assembly is going to say, all right, your agency's better than us. We're probably going to accept your recommendations. But the General Assembly is going to become very involved in allocating funds for K-12 education, higher education, Medicaid to some extent, and some other non-executive branch programs or new initiatives of the General Assembly. That's where most of the focus is going to be on the legislative process. So what are the goals of the budget process? Probably going to differ from person to person, but I think generally as a state as long as I've been around, our primary goals have been fiscal integrity. We want to have a balanced budget. We want our expenses to be less than our projected revenues. We want that spending to be sustainable. Can we fund budgets at a certain level and feel relatively certain, minus some major change in the economy, that we can continue to fund those programs? Because the worst thing you can do is fund something high and then 2 years later have to come in and cut it way back. It's just it's not good for anybody. You want to have some stability in the process. And so sustainability is something I know, when I was in the House, we ran, actually, when we did a budget, we ran the numbers out 10 years. Didn't really talk about that with anybody, but that was something we did internally, so that we could look at and say, yep, given a certain set of reasonable assumptions, we think we can continue to fund the state government at this level into the future. We also want to adequately fund our pension obligations. That's very important. You don't want to fall behind on pensions like Illinois has, or Kentucky. A lot of other states have just gotten themselves in a big hole, and eventually those bills are going to become due, and that's going to create all kinds of problems for their state budgets in the future. So we're very focused on making sure we're putting in the right amount of money, or at least to the best of our ability, because it's hard to predict the future on pensions, just like it is with anything else. But at least you're trying to take what the actuaries tell you as the correct amount to put in. It's one of those things you're never caught up, because as soon as you get everything to the point where it's fully funded, something changes in the economy or mortality tables or whatever, and then you're back at trying to get those pension funds shored up again. Also want to maintain a AAA bond rating. That's important not only to state government, but that bond rating flows down to our local units as well and helps them to be able to borrow money at a more affordable rate. And then efficiency, always looking at ways to eliminate duplicative programs, wasteful spending. Priority of the caucus I worked for certainly was minimizing debt, and we made a lot of progress towards that over the years. And then generally, I think everybody agrees we want to keep taxes as low as we can, right? You got to fund government appropriately, but it's generally a better thing for people to be able to keep more money in their pockets, all other things equal. And so keeping our taxes low, or another way to say it would be keep our taxes stable. That's important too. You don't want to seesaw on your tax rates. And then you want successful policy outcomes. That's the whole point. You're not funding programs so that they fail. At least I sure hope we're not. That would be a pretty poor policy for the state. You want to make sure you're funding programs to the best of your ability at the levels necessary to achieve whatever your desired results are. And then the last thing on this slide, transparency. The state's made a lot of good strides on that front. You can now go to the Indiana Transparency Portal, and if you have the inclination and the time, and you want to dig deep, you can do that. We've certainly made a lot of progress over the last 20 years on that front. Okay, major budget components. I'm going to go through this real fast. I want to get to Susan's part here and leave time for questions. Biggest component is K-12 education. We have a $46.2 billion budget over the 2 years for this current biennial cycle. 47% of that budget goes to K-12 education. About 87% of that is direct aid to schools, and then 10% is an appropriation to the pre-1996 teacher pension fund. By the way, that is something that is almost fully funded and is expected to be fully funded here in the next 2 to 3 fiscal years, which will free up $1 billion worth of state funds. So that's something to watch for. That's a pretty big achievement. Higher education, about 9% of the budget. Most of that goes to university operating, and then almost 20% of that money goes to student financial aid. Indiana actually has a pretty robust need-based financial aid program, and it's been important to continue to fund that over the years. Next slide. Medicaid, that is a big one everybody is talking about. It wasn't all that long ago, maybe 15 years ago, that Medicaid, at least the state portion of Medicaid, made up about 9% of the state's general fund budget. As of the latest budget, that number is 22%. So Medicaid is a focus of state fiscal leaders. Senate Bill 1 was heard yesterday in appropriations, and there are several other bills that are all kind of geared at how do we um, control Medicaid growth. And a big reason of that is because, it's growing faster than the rest of the budget. So relatively, it's taking up a bigger slice of the pie, which means, less slices of the pie for everybody else. So currently 22% of the budget, and that's just the state's share, about 2/3 of the cost. This is a really rough number because we have, it's complicated, but generally 2/3 is paid by the federal government, 1/3 is paid by the state, and that's going to vary widely by program. Already talked about pensions. We want to make sure those are fully funded to the best of our ability. And then everything else, right? Everything else in the budget outside of Medicaid and K-12 and those things, it's really just 25%. Health and Human Services is the next biggest chunk, and that's going to include DCS. It's within that 8%. General government, so just your hate to say average state agency or the funding for the legislative branch or the courts, that all falls in that 6%. The corrections budget is 5% of our overall budget, and that's of course just one big agency. Public safety, state police, Department of Homeland Security, it's only 2% of our budget. In this particular budget, and this number probably varies the most from budget to budget, but our capital expenditures, so maintenance on state buildings or just building new things, in this last budget was only 1%. And that's actually a reflection of the tight budget picture. If you look back a few years, that number would have been higher, but we just didn't have the money to go out and build new projects, and so that kept that number down for this particular cycle. And there's everything I said in a convenient pie chart. So I could have skipped all those other slides. You guys could have just looked at this instead. But I always like pictures, simple-minded. So pictures are always the best. And at this point, it's Susan's turn. So thank you. I hope people have some questions for me at the end. I'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, everybody, let's talk about reserve funds. Yay. So the state has 3 reserve funds. One's called we all colloquially call it the rainy day fund, but it's the countercyclical revenue and economic stabilization fund. All 3 of these funds are governed by statute. There's a lot of misconceptions out there around how this money can be used. And so I think the most important thing to understand is that the use of these funds are set by statute. So even if the state wanted to, you can't just, this money is not, easily accessed or used for anything other than what the law says. So the code cite's there, 41018. As of the updated forecast, which is the last combined balance statement we have, the balance there is 1.1 billion. So this account is basically kind of a hedge that the state can use during economic downturns. So money comes in and out of the fund based on a formula that's in this code site, and basically triggered by a drop of 2% or more in annual personal income growth, allows transfers to the general fund for shortfalls or to fund specific state needs. The next one is the Medicaid Reserve Fund. So this can only be used for Medicaid. So this fund, the idea behind this fund is to have it there again as a hedge, since the Medicaid program is an obligation. We have a liability. I mean, we have to pay these claims for Medicaid. So it's important to have the ability to transfer money when we need it. So right now the balance is 375 million. I will say that over the years, whenever there's a money left over from the Medicaid appropriation that the General Assembly enacts in the budget. A lot of, actually, most years that I can remember, that money was put into the general fund, which I always had a lot of heartburn about because when we need it, it wasn't there. So I am very happy that in the last few cycles, the decision has been made to put excess money from those appropriations back into the fund, which is great. And I'm super, super happy about that. That's really good policy. So that's a great decision. So the last one is a tuition reserve account, again, governed by statute. So this can only be used to for K through 12 tuition support distributions. So if for some reason the appropriation falls short, it's used to shore up that funding. And it also can cover shortfalls for the Choice Scholarship Program. And then again, this is kind of interesting. Any funds transferred from the account to the general fund have to be repaid by the end of that state fiscal year. So as of last month, the balance was $721.7 million. So as you can see here, we have a lot of, we're going to have a lot of money based on this latest revised forecast, which was really an eye opener for everyone, I'm sure. Since Ben and I weren't in the, I wasn't in the forecast committee anymore because I was gone by then. I was really surprised. I thought it would be favorable, but I had no idea they'd be adding as much money as they added. So what we're looking at here is the blue is the total ending combined balances. So total ending combined balances, what that means is combined balances means the general fund money, which I always think about as the state's checking account. So money in, money out. Then we have the reserve funds, the 3 reserve funds we just talked about. So whenever you hear the term combined balance, that means the general fund money and the reserve fund money together. Again, remembering that only the general fund money is really money that can be easily used. So the through line here, as you can see, it's a percent of current year expenditures. And what that means is it's the amount of money that we have, the amount of money in the combined balance as a percent of what the current year spend is in terms of the budget. So there's a lot of kind of, I don't want to say disagreement, but there's a lot of talk in the public finance kind of community, what's the appropriate percentage to have. And there are those of us like me who think that, kind of anything over 12% is excessive. To me, this represents taxpayer money. So on the one hand, it's really important to have enough reserves. COVID showed us that. We were very fortunate that we had enough money in our reserves that we could manage COVID a lot more readily than other states could with fewer reserves. But again, anything over 12 makes me a little not nervous, but unhappy. So we are going to be at 21.9%, which even for people who, and this is not a political thing at all. I remember older Democrat fiscal analysts like John Grew, who, would love to have a 20% reserve balance. And anybody who knows John knows that that's true. So, but obviously this is a lot of money to be sitting on. The challenge is what to spend this money on. And we can talk about that a little bit later. Next slide, please. Again, this is just another way to show these balances. So again, this is a good way to show this. So the blue is the general fund. The red is tuition reserve. The green is rainy day, and the purple is Medicaid reserve. So you can see kind of the flow of this, how these amounts have changed over the year, and basically how they're divided up is kind of interesting too. So yeah, we'll see what happens. So this is another interesting way of expressing this too. And I can't remember, I think it's the Ben can Ben can correct me, but I think the Pew has like a state fiscal conditions reporting that they do that's super helpful, and I used a lot. I'm sure Ben probably looked at it too. And so this represents how many days we could go. For example, if there was a zombie apocalypse, this is how I think about this. A zombie apocalypse where nobody is buying anything, nobody's getting gas, nobody's spending any money, so we don't have any revenue coming in. We could last 78 days with our estimated combined balances for fiscal year 27 based on this most recent forecast update. And anyway, no, that's okay. Thanks, Stephanie. So the next here is just a representation of structural budget surplus. This is another kind of important distinction to understand. So when we say structural budget surplus or deficit, what that means is the general fund, the condition of the general fund. So if you have more money coming in than you have going out in appropriations, you have a surplus. Now, anything over zero is a surplus. And you want to, of course, not be in a deficit situation. You always want to be having more money coming in than going out. How much more is a question we can all discuss. But anyway, this shows over time what that structural surplus, general fund surplus or deficit looks like. These red areas, sometimes these are represented by payment delays, and this is kind of timing. Other times these are economic downturns or whatever. So that's just another way of showing there. So obviously you always want to be in the black. How much now to be $3.9 billion in the black, that's a lot. So I'm more comfortable with a lower amount. But here's the next slide, base revenue versus net outgoing expenditures. So again, general fund only. So this shows kind of, these are just another way of showing this. So as you can see, we're going to have a lot more revenue coming in than we're spending. Okay, let's talk about the sources of our money. So we have sales tax, income tax, corporate tax, wagering tax, also called gaming taxes. Then we have other taxes, including taxes on cigarettes and other tobacco products, alcohol beverages, insurance products, interest earnings on state-held funds, and then recapture of motor vehicle excise tax, commercial vehicle excise tax, and local financial institution taxes, which is part of corporate income tax. Now, in Indiana, we rely most on sales and use tax, which is a little unusual. There are a lot of states that don't have quite so much dependence on sales tax. So next slide, please. So you can see, just as we just kind of looked at, sales is almost 50% of our income, our revenue. Individual is at 37%, corporate's at 4%, Riverport wagering is 1%, Brasino 1%, cigarettes at 2%, insurance at 2%, miscellaneous at 3%. So all in, it's about $47 billion. So let's see, the next is actual and forecasted. So this is just another way to show what the forecast is anticipating or estimating that we will have to use going forward. So this is another way to show percent change in general fund state tax revenue. So just another percent change in revenue, which is the blue, and then the red is the change in revenue as received. So again, this is just updated for the new forecast. Another way to show this is, so if you look at, these are comparing the different forecasts and the updates. So this kind of shows you how much this can change in just a span of a few months, which is I know it's really surprising for a lot of people, and people think, oh my God, there's something going on and how can this happen? And well, it can happen. And I agree with Ben that the consensus forecast process has been a very successful model for us. And they're very rarely off. So this just represents the change in the forecast.
Just one thing to just add, there's two different numbers for April. There's the April forecast, which was done before the end of the session, so before anything revenue related was enacted, and then this what color is that? Purplish? I don't know.
Yeah.
The colors here. This purplish bar is what we refer to as the April 2025 budget forecast, and that's basically the April forecast adjusted for any kind of revenue changes that were enacted by the General Assembly post forecast. So the forecast only takes into account the law as it stands at that very minute. And the biggest change between April 15th and the end of the session was the General Assembly significantly increased the cigarette tax. So the cigarette tax was built into this, or the expected revenue was built into this purplish number. And so really the best comparison from April to December is going to be the purple bar with the teal, teal bar.
Yeah.
So, sorry, just wanted to.
No, thank you. That's really important because the cigarette tax increase has generated a lot of money. I think it's been really surprising how much it's generated, and that's what we want, along with the related decreasing consumption, which I think is also happening, which is really good. That's the point.
Yep.
Thank you for that clarification. This is my favorite graph. This is very helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting because it really just shows you the seesaw effect in 2026. We started the process thinking we had 23.2 billion to spend roughly, and now we're sitting in December of 2025 and we think we have 23.2 billion. But what happened in between? And what happened in between was the timing of the April 2025 forecast was rough. It was right when President Trump announced tariffs, and nobody at the time knew how that was going to impact us. It was just a complete unknown. And so our economic forecaster, who provides all the data, it's S&P Global, they reacted like a lot of other economists and said, we think this is going to be a big impact on the Indiana economy, and it's going to drive down revenue projections. But of course, no one really knew, right, what was actually going to go into effect, what was the timing. We still probably don't know 100% what's going to happen, but things have we've had more data, we've had more, longer term view on where the economy is heading. And I think that's what, more than anything else, that's what pushed those numbers back up to where we originally thought they were going to be. But granted, it's a forecast. Susan said it well. Indiana actually, based on the numbers from the Pew study that they put out, Indiana has the third most accurate forecast, and the two states that are more accurate than us, I actually don't believe. I think what happens is they miss by 10% high, and then they miss by 10% low, and it just happens to average to a low miss. Indiana's miss is typically within 1%. Now, granted, things change, right? So if you look back at April, yeah, that was a bigger number, but when you really get to kind of that final forecast that is in place during the fiscal year, those tend to be pretty spot on. I think we were within 0.1% for fiscal year 25, if I'm remembering.
Crazy.
Right. So it's a good process. And I think one of the questions, if that's okay, Stephanie, I kind of want to answer this one because it was a good one.
Yeah.
Question about how often is a consensus not achieved on the forecast?
Never.
Ever. We always have a consensus forecast. That's one of the beautiful things about the process. Now, are people going to have doubts about it? Yeah, absolutely. That's happened. During the Great Recession, people had big doubts about the forecast. Susan lived through that back in the day. But people are going to have a lot of different opinions. But at the end of the day, the people that put the forecast together are able to set aside their opinions about what they would like to see happen. And we look at the data and we say, gosh, we know we're going to be wrong. You're going to be wrong. It's forecast. Of course, you're going to be wrong. But is this the best we can do given the data that we have today? Because we have all this economic data to go off of, projected into the future. We don't know how accurate it's going to be, but it's what we have in front of us. And then we have formulas that have shown a very good history of taking those economic variables and relating them back to state revenue collections. And so because we have that process, we're able to all sit around the table at the end of the day and look at each other and say, I think this is the best we can do. 'Cause nobody wants to be wrong. You don't want to give your members bad information. You don't want to overstate it or understate it. to the extent possible. And so we get to a consensus every time, and that's great. And then what that means is on the General Assembly side, they're not spending all their time arguing about the revenue. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, gosh, Susan, it's hard enough to put a budget together, but if you had to sit around the table and everybody had their own forecast, governor put out a forecast and the House put out a forecast and the Senate put out a forecast, and then we sat around and argued about how much money we had to spend, that wouldn't be a very productive process. And I know that happens in other states, and I think it's so vitally important that Indiana maintain this consensus model because it's worked. It's gotten us to fairly accurate forecast results that are unbiased by political opinion, and it allows legislators to focus their time and attention on what they really should be doing, and that is how do you allocate the resources.
We maybe have time for a few more questions. So if you have a question that you haven't asked, you can put it in the Q&A now. Someone did ask if we will share the presentation slides. The answer is yes. You should receive those next week, early next week, Monday.
And Stephanie, I have time to stay if there are more questions. I mean, I know Ben has to go, but I'm happy to. If it
I'm good for a little while. I could probably do that.
Okay.
5-10
Do we
minutes.
know? Do we know the answer to Sue's questions here?
I don't know. So Sue, we're going to get back with you on some of your questions about DLGF reports. I'm with you. Tracking trends is really important. So let's put a pin in that. And we'll get back with you and we'll find you a good data set or sets. All right. Okay. That might be it.
We've bored them to tears, Ben. That's what I'm taking from this.
Well,
Well,
I
they're
think
stunned stunned by
So
fascinating these
you mentioned
topics.
some dates. If there are advocates or local governments here and they want to start talking to their legislators about funding priorities for the next budget, when do they need to start talking to them? So let's talk about some of those dates again.
Yeah, so it never hurts to get in sooner than later.
Okay.
Things get super busy. If you're waiting until January or February to get in and say, hey, we want to talk to you about this, at that point, the ship is pulled out of port. It is out on its way out to the ocean at that point. So the sooner you can get in, the better. You really, I mean, most people are typically coming in to see the chairman around, post Labor Day is generally when I would always see the uptick in meeting requests. That's a pretty good time frame because at that point we're just starting to really think about the budget again, and we're looking ahead. The revenue forecast typically gets in process in October, so that kind of September, October, November time frame, pretty good time to come in and chat with people. Try to get in during session, and your odds of getting time are slimmer. And at that point, so many things have already been in motion that it's going to be more of a challenge the longer you wait.
Right. Can the legislature override a veto, presumably budget or otherwise veto by the governor?
Yes.
How does that happen? Is it a simple majority or?
Yeah, just like any other bill.
Okay. When the revenue forecast is increased as it was in December, how is the additional revenue allocated and what will happen during the current session or current year? Current budget, yeah.
I'll let Susan weigh in too. Just my take on it. I don't think we're going to see any expenditure of resources on a significant level this session. I certainly haven't seen any sign of it. Legislators, fiscal leaders especially, they tend to not want to spend in non-budget years, even if the situation has changed. Right? Part of it is, well, do we really know? Right? We just got a new forecast in December. We could get a new forecast that takes it the other way again, right? I mean, there's that possibility. The other thing that fiscal leaders are pretty in tune with, and I do want Susan to answer from her perspective, but when you're trying to look at spending money in a non-budget year, you're not laying out your full array of priorities, right? You're looking at things in isolation, and something may sound like a really good thing in isolation, but when you're lining that up against, all right, K-12 education, or the Medicaid forecast, or DCS, or corrections, whatever it may be, you may take a different perspective. You may say, well, gosh, this thing seems important, but gosh, if I have to choose all these other things versus this, I'm probably going to choose all these other things before I get down to this. It's lower down the priority list. And so that tends to be, I think, the biggest hesitation to say, yeah, okay, we have some extra money. We get it. We're the numbers are the numbers. There's going to be money doesn't get spent some way, shape, or form. There's going to be a lot of excess money. But it is important that you look at the big picture and you line up your priorities and not look at things in isolation.
So I did have a new question. Is there a history, however infrequently, of opening the budget in a non-budget year? And if so, what were the reasons that caused that to happen?
Go ahead.
What are the outliers?
So this is semantics, right?
Mhm.
I mean, nobody wants, I mean, and Ben can correct me if I'm wrong, but opening the budget truly means, the floodgates are open, everybody can come in, ask for whatever they want, and it's a precedent that I can't speak for the majority, but I'm sure that they don't want to set. That being said, there have been sessions where money is spent. There have been non-budget sessions where money is spent. And what I can think of the most is kind of like road funding, or I think there have been examples where either new revenue mechanisms are set up to generate more money, and then that money is spent in a non-budget year. So that's how I would frame that. But I do think, there are things that I wish the General Assembly would do that, like for the example that comes to mind really for me is, so there, because of that 10% holdback, there was no capital spend for higher ed, for example. This is a time where, if they were inclined to do so, they could say, okay, we're going to cash fund the number one priorities for all the higher education, all the public higher education institutions. They could do that. Now, the problem logistically and in kind of all reality, the way this works is that once you spend money for something, everyone's going to come and say, okay, but what about my stuff? And what about my stuff? And what about my stuff? So I don't think that they're going to be spending any money until the budget session. Now, when the budget session comes, another thing I think that we all need to recognize that is reality is that even with all that extra money, the odds are against putting more money into ongoing program expenditures. So what I suspect will happen is that they will do what they've done in the past, which is to maybe then fund capital projects, cash funded, one-time only spends, more money into pension funds, all of that. So that's what I suspect will happen.
In other words, if the program line item got cut in this last session, don't expect that you're going to get it back up to where it was before.
I think that's right. I don't think that's maybe not how I would approach it, but I think that's probably what would happen.
I think that's a fair expectation. I think it's going to vary based on the program. At least I hope it does. I think what they'll find is some programs that had money withheld are probably doing just fine with less money. I mean, we found that back in 2008, 2009, 2010. There were some programs who, by the way, back then, some of the cuts were as much as 30% to state agencies. That's a pretty big number. Some of them were just fine. I mean, just to be honest. Others reached a breaking point, right? And I think we'll see that again this time around. There are certain agencies that probably can handle it. Maybe they need to modernize. Maybe they aren't fully staffed anyways, and so some of that savings just gets absorbed by empty positions they already had. But then you're going to see other areas like DCS. They had to be augmented, or the expectation is they will have to be augmented this year. Corrections as well. I mean, those are some agencies that may just not have the ability to do it, and they perform critical services that have to be fulfilled. And so I suspect it's going to be a little bit of a picking and choosing about who can and who can't. It's probably not just a blanket. Everybody gets their withholding back.
One other question: does the state have any debt?
Does, but it's pretty low. Our debt per capita is pretty low, and that's how state debt is usually measured. It's debt per capita, debt per person. And
I
it's pretty well.
think the number, oh, I didn't put it in this slide deck. I do have that chart somewhere, but I think that number's around $1 billion at this point, right around. It's down about 40% over the last 10 years because the state just hasn't taken on a lot of new debt. We've paid off a lot of debt through excess, like Susan mentioned. That's one thing that happens sometimes when you have excess money. You just pay off your debt. At the local level, there's been a lot of, I know there's some local government folks here, but the number at the local level is closer to 53, $54 billion. So roughly 50 times the amount of debt that the state has. Now, granted, a lot of that's wrapped up in, a new elementary school or firehouse or whatever. So there's a lot of capital needs out at the local level. So it's not, don't want to suggest it's anyway an apples to apples comparison, but I will tell you the General Assembly has been focused the last 10 years on limiting state debt as much as possible, and they have taken a lot of pride in lowering the state's debt load. There has been some recent focus. You'll see it in Senate Bill 1, certainly. That's a whole other topic, Stephanie. I don't want to dive down that deep rabbit hole. Maybe another seminar one of these days. But there is some renewed focus from the General Assembly on, well, hey, we've lowered our debt. What's going on at the local level? So that's just something to continue to watch out for, because that when I talk to members, they still are pretty focused on debt.
We probably will be diving into that issue around local government financing and local debt, and some of the policy changes and the impact on localities. Nothing in blood yet, but it's definitely on our radar to dig a little deeper into. I think this is a good natural stopping point. I want to thank Ben, thank you, and Susan, thank you. Everybody, I will be sending out again the presentation and the recording, and then shameless plug. Please consider joining us for our webinar on the Indiana Housing Dashboard, which is just so cool. And a lot of people don't know it's out there. And so this is a cash course primer for anybody who needs to have really great housing market data for their area. I wish this existed 20 years ago. Alas, no, it does. And then also that's on January 27th, and that's online. And then on April 16th, we will be hosting our third annual policy summit, and it's going to be on economic development policy. We've got speakers lined up already, and we would really love to see, especially a lot of local voices at that event, because I think it's going to be a really great conversation. And again, that's on April 16th in Indianapolis. So thanks again, guys. And hey, everybody, enjoy your cold Friday. Have a good one.
Thank you.